England, 1812, the Regency era. Charlotte spent 3 consecutive nights condemning the cowardly Duke who had abandoned her village. She said everything she truly thought, directly to the face of a mysterious traveller at the inn. What she didn't know was that the stranger, quietly taking note of every word, was the Duke himself, Duke. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in sheets over the cobblestones of Ashbourne, drowning the lanterns, swallowing the sound of carriage wheels, turning the narrow roads into rivers of mud and shadow. The village sat at the edge of the moors like something forgotten, a cluster of stone buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a market square where the vendors no longer bothered to set up their stalls on wet mornings. And at the centre of it all, like the last warm thing left in the world, stood the Thornwood Inn. Its windows glowed amber against the dark. Inside, the fire was high, the benches crowded, and the smell of roasted mutton and tallow candles hung thick in the air. Travellers came through Ashbourne on their way to Bath, to London, to places that mattered more, and most of them barely looked up from their plates long enough to notice the village at all. Charlotte Beaumont had lived here all her life. She knew every crack in every wall of that inn. She knew which floorboard creaked near the 3rd step, which window latch refused to close properly in the wind, which table by the fire was always claimed by old Mr. Hensley, who had not, in 30 years, sat anywhere else. She knew the people of Ashbourne the way she knew her own heartbeat, by instinct, by love, by the particular ache of watching something you care for slowly come undone. Because Ashbourne was coming undone. The roads had not been repaired in 4 years. The bridge at the north end of the village had been condemned, and no one had replaced it. 3 families had left last winter. Good families, working families, because the rent had been raised again, and the harvest had been poor, and there was simply no help coming from the estate that owned half the land in the county. The Duke of Ashbourne's estate. The Duke who had not set foot in this village in 7 years. Charlotte stood behind the counter of the inn. It belonged to her father, though he was too ill now to stand behind it himself, and she looked at the crowded room and felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The anger she kept carefully banked, like coals under ash, always there, always controlled. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and she had opinions about everything. That was not considered a virtue in 1812. She had never cared very much about what was considered a virtue. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp with rain and something else, wood smoke, leather, the night. Several heads turned. Charlotte turned too, automatically, the way you turn toward movement. A man stepped inside. He was tall, taller than most men she knew, which meant he had to duck slightly under the low beam of the doorframe, a detail that might have looked awkward on someone else, but on him looked merely deliberate, as though he had assessed the beam and decided to acknowledge it on his own terms. He wore a dark travelling coat, completely unremarkable, the kind any gentleman of middling means might wear on the road. His boots were good. She noticed that because Charlotte Beaumont noticed everything, but not ostentatiously so. No signet ring, no livery, no footman trailing behind him. He pushed the wet hair from his forehead with one hand and looked around the room with the particular calm of a man who was accustomed to arriving in places and taking stock of them. His eyes moved across the crowded benches, the fire, the counter. They landed on Charlotte. She looked back at him without expression. He looked back at her with the ghost of something, not quite a smile, not quite an assessment, something in between. Then he crossed the room toward her, and Charlotte's first thought was that whoever this man was, he was used to rooms moving around him rather than the other way. Her second thought was that she was not a room. "Good evening," he said. His voice was low, measured, the voice of a man who had learned that he did not need to raise it to be heard. "Evening," she said. "1 shilling for supper, 2 for a room if there are any left." "Is there one left?" She glanced at the board behind her. 1 key remained, the corner room on the upper floor, the one with the window that overlooked the moors. The best room in the house. She had been saving it. She turned back to him. "There is." She had not been saving it for him, but something in the way he stood there, patient, certain, not quite arrogant, but adjacent to it, made her reach for the key without further argument. She placed it on the counter between them. He picked it up. His fingers were ink-stained, she noticed. Not the soft hands of a man who had never worked, but not the rough hands of a labourer either. Somewhere in between. Somewhere that didn't quite make sense. "Supper as well," he said. "It'll be brought up." "I'd prefer to eat down here." Charlotte looked at the crowded room, every bench full, every table occupied, the fire snapping and the noise of 20 conversations competing with the rain outside. "There's no table free," she said. He looked at the room the same way he had looked at everything else, with that infuriating calm. "There will be," he said. And he was right, because 2 minutes later, old Mr. Hensley finished his ale and left, and the table by the fire opened up like an inevitability. The man sat down. Charlotte brought him his supper with more force than was strictly necessary. He looked up at her as she set down the plate. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "You're blocking the heat from the rest of the room." There was a pause. And then, very quietly, in a way that she would think about later in the dark of her own room with considerable irritation, he laughed. This was how it began. He came back the next evening. Charlotte told herself she hadn't noticed the time. She told herself she certainly hadn't looked at the door at 7:30, or at 7:45, or at 8 precisely, the approximate hour he had arrived the night before. She told herself these things with the firm conviction of a woman who is lying to herself and knows it, but continues anyway out of sheer principle. At 8:05, the door opened. He was wearing the same dark coat, or one exactly like it. She couldn't tell, and the fact that she had looked closely enough to wonder irritated her more than the uncertainty itself. He crossed to the counter. "The corner room again," he said. "You didn't check out?" "No." "You could have mentioned that this morning." "I could have," he agreed pleasantly. "Same table?" She stared at him. "Mr. Hensley sits at that table." "Mr. Hensley," the man said, "left an hour ago. I watched him from the window." Charlotte opened her mouth. Closed it. She was fairly certain she was being managed, and she was fairly certain he knew she knew, and she was completely certain that he found this amusing, which was the most irritating thing of all. "Your name," she said, "for the register." "Hartwell," he said, "Alexander Hartwell." She wrote it down. She did not look up when she said, "Purpose of your stay, Mr. Hartwell?" "Surveying," he said. "Surveying what?" "The area." She looked up then. He was watching her with that same expression, attentive, composed, the expression of a man listening to something most people wouldn't think worth listening to. "The area," she repeated. "Yes." "There's nothing in this area worth surveying," she said, and she was surprised by how much she meant it, not as self-pity but as fact, as accusation aimed at no one in the room, but at someone far away, in London, in a house far too large for a man who had abandoned the people whose rents paid for it. Something shifted in his face, so brief she almost missed it. "Perhaps," he said. "That depends on what you're looking for." She put down the register. "Supper is mutton tonight," she said, "or mutton." "I'll have the mutton." She walked away before he could say anything else. But later, when the room had thinned and the fire had settled, and she was wiping down the counter with more vigor than the wood required, she became aware that he had not left. He sat at the corner table with a glass of wine he hadn't finished, and a small notebook open in front of him, and he was writing something. She watched him for 3 seconds exactly. He did not look up. She went back to wiping the counter. The argument began on the 3rd evening. It began, as most arguments do, in the middle of something else. A conversation that had started neutrally enough about the road conditions between Ashbourne and the next village, which had deteriorated to the point of genuine danger. 3 horses lost their footing on that road last month, Charlotte said. She had not meant to say it to him specifically. She had been saying it in various forms to various people for 6 months. It had become a kind of reflex, the injustice of it too large to keep entirely inside. "The North Road?" he asked. She looked at him. He was watching her with that attentive stillness. "Yes," she said, "the North Road. The one that hasn't been repaired in 4 years because the estate that owns it cannot be bothered to maintain it." "Cannot be bothered," he said carefully, "or has not been informed of the extent of the damage." She set down the glass she was holding. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "I have written 4 letters to the Ashbourne estate offices in the past 2 years. I have had 3 replies, all of which used more words to say nothing than I have previously believed possible. I have attended 2 meetings of the parish council where the same subject was raised and the same response was given, that the matter was under review." She paused. "Under review. 4 years. 3 horses." He was quiet for a moment. "And the Duke himself?" he asked. "Have you written to him directly?" The laugh that came out of Charlotte was not a kind one. "The Duke," she said, "has not been to Ashbourne in 7 years. He is, by all accounts, very comfortable in London. I imagine the roads in Mayfair are in excellent repair." "You imagine," he said. His tone was not combative, it was thoughtful, which was somehow worse. "I deduce," she said, "from available evidence, which is what a person does when they are not given facts." "That's fair," he said. She blinked. She had not expected that. "It is fair," he continued, turning his wineglass slowly between his fingers, "to be angry when the systems that are supposed to work do not work. It is also fair to ask whether the person at the top of those systems knows the full extent of what is failing. Are you defending him?" "I'm asking a question." "For the answer," Charlotte said, "is that it does not matter whether he knows. It matters that he should know. It matters that knowing is his responsibility. A man who owns half a county owns its problems, whether he chooses to look at them or not." Something in Alexander Hartwell's face went very still. She noticed it, filed it away without knowing why. "You are quite direct," he said at last. "Someone has to be." "Most people are not. Most people in a village like this would not say those things about the Duke to a stranger in the inn. Most people in a village like this," she said, "are afraid. I have decided not to be." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it, not uncomfortably, but with the particular awareness of being truly seen rather than merely observed. "That," he said quietly, "is either very brave or very foolish." "In my experience," Charlotte said, picking up her glass again, "those are usually the same thing." She walked away. In her room that night, she lay awake longer than usual and tried to determine why the conversation had unsettled her. Not because he had argued. Men argued with her often, dismissively, condescendingly, as though her opinions were a charming eccentricity to be corrected. He had not done that. He had listened. He had pushed back gently, seriously, as though her words were worth engaging with rather than simply overriding. She was not sure she knew what to do with that. She fell asleep to the sound of rain on the moors and dreamed, for reasons she refused to examine, of ink-stained fingers and a glass of wine that was never quite finished. He stayed a week. This was not what travellers did. Travellers passed through Ashbourne in a night, 2 at most, and moved on toward places with better roads and better opinions of themselves. They did not stay a week. They did not come down to supper every evening and sit at the corner table and argue about politics and drainage systems and the moral obligations of inherited wealth. They did not look at Charlotte Beaumont as though she were the most interesting thing they had encountered in a very long time. She told herself she was not flattered. She told herself this with the same committed dishonesty with which she had previously told herself she wasn't watching the door at 8 o'clock, and with approximately the same success. The conversations continued. On the 4th evening, they argued about the enclosure of the common fields. Charlotte had very strong feelings about this, and so, it turned out, did he, though his perspective was more complex than she had initially expected, acknowledging competing interests with an even-handedness that forced her to sharpen her own arguments rather than simply repeat them louder. On the 5th evening they talked about the hospital. There had been one once at the edge of the village, a small building, barely more than a cottage, where Dr. Beaumont had seen patients for 30 years. Her father, now too ill to practice, his hands unreliable, his eyes going. The building had been sold to cover debts. The nearest physician was now 6 miles away. 6 miles, Alexander said. In winter, Charlotte said, on those roads. The muscle in his jaw moved. She'd started to notice it, the small signs of something breaking through the composed surface, the way his hands stilled on the table when something moved him, the way he looked away briefly toward the window before answering, as though he needed a moment to keep his voice level. That is unacceptable, he said. Yes, she said, it is. On the 6th evening he did not come down for supper. Charlotte told herself this was fine. She served the other guests and refilled the fire and told herself it was completely, entirely fine, and that she had not arranged the evening's conversation topics in her head while carrying linens up the stairs that afternoon. At 9:30 she went up to check the hallway lamps. His door was open an inch. She could see the light of a single candle inside and the sound, barely audible, of a pen moving across paper. She stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. She did not knock. She went back downstairs. On the 7th evening he came down late. The room had mostly emptied. The fire was lower, the noise reduced to a few murmured conversations between locals who had known each other 40 years and didn't need many words. He sat down at the corner table and she brought him supper without being asked, because by the 7th evening this had become simply what happened. You're leaving tomorrow, she said. It was not a question. He looked up at her. Something in his face was different tonight. More open, perhaps, or more careful in a different way, as though he had made a decision and was still deciding whether to stand by it. "Yes," he said, "I have to return to... I have obligations." "Of course," she said. She turned to go. "Miss Beaumont." She turned back. He was holding the notebook, not offering it to her, just holding it open so that she could see the pages without being able to read the writing from this distance. Dense, small handwriting, filling every line. "You should know," he said, "that these conversations have been useful to me." "Useful," she repeated. "In ways I did not anticipate," he said, and then more quietly, "I want you to know that." Charlotte looked at him for a moment, at the notebook in his hands, at the look on his face that she still could not quite name. Serious, and beneath the seriousness, something else. Something that made her throat feel strange. "I hope your surveying was productive, Mr. Hartwell," she said carefully. "More than I expected," he said. She went back to the counter. He sat for another hour, not writing, just sitting with the empty wineglass and the closed notebook, looking at the fire. When she looked up for the last time before going to bed, his table was empty. The notebook was gone. But on the table, neatly placed beside the cleaned plate, was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. 4 words. "The North Road, soon." She stood holding the paper in the empty room, listening to the fire settle, and felt something she could not name, hope, maybe, or its more dangerous cousin, belief. She folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She did not throw it away. He came back 3 weeks later. Not as Alexander Hartwell, traveller. Charlotte was in the market square when it happened. A grey Tuesday morning. Thin clouds, the smell of coming rain. She was buying vegetables from Mrs. Alderton and half listening to the woman's commentary on the state of the butcher's new sign when the sound of carriage wheels changed. Different from the usual, heavier, more deliberate. She turned. The carriage was black, lacquered to a shine that had no business being on roads this poor. 4 horses, all matched, a coachman in livery, and on the door, a crest. The Ashbourne crest. Charlotte had seen it on letters. On the brass plate of the estate office in the village, long since closed. On the documents her father had signed when he'd first leased the building that had been their home and their surgery for 3 decades. The carriage stopped in the centre of the square. The coachman descended. The door opened. And Charlotte Beaumont's entire understanding of the past 7 evenings rearranged itself in approximately 3 seconds. He stepped down from the carriage the same way he had stepped through the door of the inn that first night, with that particular, infuriating self-possession, the quality of a man who had never needed to rush. He wore better clothes now, not ostentatiously fine, but unmistakably correct, the kind of clothes that announce their own quality without effort. His cravat was white and precisely tied. His coat was dark blue, well cut. He looked exactly like himself. Which was the problem? He was talking to someone, his land steward, she would later learn, and he had not yet looked toward the square. People were stopping, turning, murmuring. The Duke of Ashbourne in Ashbourne for the first time in 7 years. The news spread through the market like water finding level. Charlotte did not move. She stood with Mrs. Alderton's turnips in her basket and the paper still in her apron pocket. She had transferred it without examining why from apron to apron every day for 3 weeks, and she watched him. He looked up. His eyes found her immediately, the way they had that first evening, as though she were the first thing he looked for. He went very still. She had a sudden vivid image of herself 7 days ago saying, "The Duke has not been to Ashbourne in 7 years. I imagine the roads in Mayfair are in excellent repair." And him sitting there listening, saying, "That's fair." The heat that rose in her face was not embarrassment. It was too hot for embarrassment. It was the specific scalding sensation of having been profoundly, irrevocably made a fool of, and knowing with horrible clarity that the worst part was not what she had said, but how much she had meant it. She turned and walked away. He sent a letter that afternoon. She did not open it until evening after the supper rush, when she was alone in the back room with the accounts and the fire, and no more excuses for delay. "Miss Beaumont, I am aware that this morning was not the introduction I owe you. If you will permit me to explain, not to excuse, but to explain, I would be grateful for the opportunity. I'm at Ashbourne Hall until the end of the month. I would very much like to call on you at your convenience at any hour you choose. If you do not wish to receive me, I will understand. Yours." Ashbourne. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the other paper in the pocket of her apron. She sat with the fire for a long time. The anger was real. She wanted to be clear about that. It was not misplaced, it was not irrational. She had been deceived. He had sat across from her and listened to her speak about him, about his failures, his absences, his responsibilities, and he had not said a word. He had let her speak, and he had taken notes, and he had not corrected the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of every conversation. That was real, that mattered. But the road outside the inn, which she had walked over yesterday, had workers on it. 6 of them with tools and stone, repairing the surface with a thoroughness that spoke of actual resources and actual instruction. But the letter she had received from the parish council this morning had mentioned that the drainage project, stalled for 2 years, had been approved for funding. But the North Road soon was 3 weeks old, and the North Road was already half rebuilt. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. She was not ready to forgive him. But she was honest enough to admit that she was not sure the word forgive was even accurate. You forgave someone who had wronged you. What he had done was more complicated. He had listened to her. He had come to this village and sought out the truth by becoming invisible, by removing the title that made everyone tell him what he wanted to hear, and he had found her instead. He had listened to her speak for 7 evenings. And then he had gone away and done exactly what she had said needed doing. She picked up her pen. Your Grace. Tomorrow, 11 o'clock. Miss Charlotte Beaumont. She sent it before she could change her mind. She had never been inside the hall. This was not unusual. Very few people in the village had in recent years. The gates had been kept closed, the staff reduced to a skeleton, the house maintained in the impersonal way of a property that is cared for, but not inhabited. Walking through those gates on a grey Wednesday morning felt like stepping into a story she had always known the outline of, but never the interior. The house was... She had not been prepared for it to be beautiful. Not in the imposing, intimidating way she might have expected. It was large, certainly. 4 stories of pale stone, long windows, a symmetry that felt earned rather than imposed. But there were roses trained along the east wall, dormant now in the early spring chill, and the gravel of the drive was bordered with the pressed-down remains of last year's lavender, and somewhere at the back of the house she could hear water. A fountain, she thought, or a stream. Something living thing. The butler received her and showed her to a sitting room that overlooked the gardens. She was looking out the window when she heard his footsteps. She turned. He was as she had last seen him in the square, the better clothes, the correct posture, the undeniable quality of him that she had somehow failed to register as ducal in the firelight of the inn. She noticed now how it sat on him, not as performance, but as something far more natural and far more uncomfortable. He was not wearing the title like a costume. He was born into it. Miss Beaumont, he said, thank you for coming. Your Grace, she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. Wrong, like calling someone by the wrong name. Something flickered in his face. Pain, maybe, or its approximation. I would prefer, he said quietly, if you would call me Alexander, at least in private. That, Charlotte said, is a significant request for a man who owes me an explanation. You're right, he said immediately. I do, please sit. She sat. He did not sit across from her. He stood by the fireplace, not because he was being formal, she thought, but because he needed something to do with the space of the room. She had the impression, for the first time, that he was nervous. Good, she thought. I want to tell you why I came to Ashbourne the way I did, he said, not as a justification, but because you deserve to understand it, not just to know it. There is a difference? I think so. Knowing is a fact, understanding is a reason. She folded her hands in her lap. Then give me the reason. He looked at her steadily. I inherited this estate at 21, he said. My father was not a careful man, he was not cruel, but he was absent in all the ways that mattered. He lived in London. He managed the estate through intermediaries. He accepted the reports they gave him without questioning them. When I inherited, the accounts were significant. The estate was generating income. The reports said everything was in order. He paused. But reports, Charlotte said slowly, are written by people with interests. Yes. Something in his posture shifted, a slight unlocking as though she had confirmed something. When I tried to visit 3 years ago, I was told the roads were in poor repair, but that repairs were underway. I was told the hospital building had been sold, but that alternative arrangements had been made. I was told every time in every letter that things were manageable. And you believed them? I believed them, he said, because I did not yet know the right questions to ask, because I was 24 years old, and I trusted men who had been managing this estate for decades and who had very good reasons to tell me what they told me. His jaw set. That was my failure. Not knowing is not innocence when knowing is your responsibility. You told me that. Charlotte was quiet. So you came in secret, she said. I came as myself. Alexander Hartwell is my mother's name. I used it. I wanted to see what was actually here, not what I would be shown if they knew who I was. He paused. I did not expect to find... He stopped. She waited. I did not expect to find someone who was already asking the right questions, he finished. The fire crackled between them. The notebook, Charlotte said. Every conversation. He said it simply, without apology. Everything you said about the roads, the hospital, the drainage, the families who left. I wrote it all down. When I returned to London, I went through the estate accounts myself, all of them. 3 years of accounts cross-referenced against what you had told me, against what I had seen. And? His expression darkened. The steward had been falsifying figures for 4 years, not dramatically, carefully, the kind of adjustments that would pass a cursory review. But when you know what you're looking for... When someone has told you what to look for, Charlotte said quietly. He met her eyes. Yes, he said, when someone has told you what to look for. The silence stretched between them, and it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that happens when two people are in the same place, after separately travelling a long distance to get there. The road, she said, is being repaired, yes. The drainage project. Funded. Work begins next month. The hospital building. He hesitated for the first time. That one is more complex. The building was sold legally. I cannot simply take it back. But I have purchased the old mill cottage at the edge of the village. I would like, if you would be willing, to help plan what is needed. You know what this village requires better than anyone I could hire from London. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 7 evenings, about conversations by firelight, about the way he had listened, not politely, not the careful half-attention she was accustomed to from men who were waiting for her to finish so they could speak, but with the full, concentrated focus of someone who considered what was being said worth considering. She thought about That's Fair. She thought about the paper still in her pocket. The North Road, soon. You used me, she said. No. The quickness of it surprised her. I listened to you, he said. I used what I learned. That is different. Is it? Yes. His voice was very quiet now. Using you would have been taking your words and never returning, taking the intelligence without... He stopped. Without what? He looked at her, and the composed surface slipped just slightly, just enough. Without coming back, he said, I came back, Miss Beaumont. She said nothing. I am not sure I could have stayed away, he said, and then, as though realizing he had said too much, from the work. There is a great deal to be done. Yes, Charlotte said, there is. She rose. He rose too, immediately, automatically, and they stood for a moment with the fireplace between them and the morning light falling through the tall windows, and something in the room that had changed shape since she had walked in. I have not forgiven you, she said. I know. I am not certain I was wronged in a way that requires forgiveness. That, he said, is possibly the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. I suspect, Charlotte said, reaching for her gloves, that it is not the last. She thought she heard him exhale, something that might have been a laugh or relief or both, as she turned toward the door. April came, and with it a kind of arrangement that had no name. She would not have called it courtship. Courtship was for ballrooms and calling cards, and the elaborate rituals of a society that moved in circles Charlotte had never quite belonged to, too educated for the farmers, too little moneyed for the gentry, too direct for everyone's comfort. What happened instead was work. Every Tuesday and Friday Charlotte came to the hall. They sat in the library, which had more books than she had imagined possible, and windows that overlooked the restored garden, and they planned. The hospital cottage, the school that had been without a proper roof for 2 years, the road to the next village, which connected 3 communities and had been listed as under review for so long that the phrase had become a local joke. Alexander brought the accounts. Charlotte brought the knowledge, who lived where, who needed what, which problems were urgent and which were merely persistent, which local craftsmen could be trusted and which would overcharge. He listened the way he had listened in the inn, with that same focused stillness, with the notebook always nearby, though now she had seen inside it, pages dense with figures and notes and small, careful diagrams. And she understood it was not merely a record, but a way of thinking, of organizing the world into manageable form. "You take notes the way I talk," she told him one afternoon. He looked up from the page. "How is that?" "As though everything matters, and you're not yet sure which things matter most." He considered this for a moment. "That is exactly right," he said. "How did you know?" "Because I do the same thing. Except I do it in my head, which is more chaotic and significantly less organized." He smiled at that, a real smile, not the measured, guarded expression she had grown accustomed to. It changed his face entirely, made him look younger somehow and considerably more human. She had started cataloguing his smiles the way she catalogued everything, without meaning to, without being entirely comfortable with the habit. The guarded one, most common, present in company, in meetings with tradespeople and local officials, reserved. The faint one appeared at the end of conversations when she had said something that surprised him, pleased but unwilling to show it fully. The real one rare, present now, something she wanted to deserve again. She looked back at her papers. "The school roof," she said. "Mr. Carver says he can start by the second week of May." "Good. The materials have been ordered." "He'll need a second man." "I've arranged it." "You work quickly," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "I have 7 years to make up for." The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. Charlotte set down her pen. She looked at him, across the library table with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the smell of old books around them, and this strange, careful, complicated thing between them that neither of them had yet named. "You could not have known," she said, "at 21, inheriting a situation that had already, you cannot hold yourself responsible for what your father failed to build. I can hold myself responsible for the 7 years after I inherited. You were managing other things." "I was avoiding this," he said, simply, without self-pity. "I knew enough to know the situation was difficult, and not enough to know how to face it. It was easier to stay in London and trust the reports." He paused. "Until I didn't trust them anymore." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "I will tell you when there is more to tell." Charlotte decided to let that be. There was time. Whatever this was, this arrangement without a name, this Tuesday and Friday library and the work and the conversations that ranged far past the practical into something else, something she was increasingly unable to ignore. There was time for the rest of it. Or so she believed. She did not consider in those weeks what the village thought. She should have. By mid-April the talk had started, quiet at first, then less so. The Duke calling on Miss Beaumont at the Hall twice a week. What business did the daughter of an innkeeper have at Ashbourne Hall with a duke, if not the obvious? Charlotte heard it third-hand from her father, who had heard it from Mrs. Alderton, who had apparently been very busy. "They are saying," her father said from his armchair by the fire, "that you have set your cap at him." "I have done no such thing." "They are also saying," he continued, with the gentle persistence of a man who had known his daughter for 23 years and had no illusions about her, "that he appears to have set his cap at you." Charlotte was quiet. "I am working with him," she said, "on practical matters. The village—" Charlotte. "Requires someone who knows." Charlotte. She stopped. Her father looked at her with the patient, clear-eyed love of a man who had watched her grow up and knew, better than anyone, what she looked like when she was telling the truth, and what she looked like when she was building a very elaborate structure of it to avoid something she wasn't ready for yet. "The road is fixed," he said. "The school is being repaired. The drainage will be sorted by summer. These are real things, good things." He paused. "They are also," he said gently, "not why you get up early on Tuesday mornings." Charlotte stared at the fire for a long time. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Love usually is," said her father. "I did not say." "No," he agreed, "you didn't." The letter arrived on a Thursday. Charlotte did not know about it directly. She had no reason to. It was addressed to the Duke of Ashbourne, and it arrived with a stack of London correspondence, and it was, by all appearances, a perfectly ordinary piece of social communication. But Mrs. Alderton's niece worked in the laundry at the Hall, and Mrs. Alderton herself had ears like a cat, and a complete absence of restraint about using them, and by Friday morning Charlotte had heard, through a chain of transmission she was already tired of tracing. that the Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess from Bath, had written to ask when her son intended to select a wife, and that she had taken the liberty of corresponding with Lady Sophia Cavendish's family, who were interested, and who were coming to Ashbourne in May. Charlotte heard this over the market counter. She said, "I see." She bought her vegetables. She walked home. She did not go to the hall on Friday. She told herself it was because she had other things to attend to. Her father, the accounts, the ordering of new linen, long overdue. She constructed the reasons carefully, the way you construct a dam, each piece placed deliberately to hold back something you are not yet prepared to face. Saturday she spent reorganizing the storeroom, which did not need organizing. Sunday she attended church and sat in the pew she had sat in every Sunday of her life, and kept her eyes forward during the prayer, and did not think about the dark blue coat in the family pew across the aisle, and the way he had looked for her when he first came in, and the way she had looked away. Monday a note arrived. "Miss Beaumont, you did not come Friday. I hope nothing is wrong. If something is wrong, I would like to help if you will let me. If you simply didn't want to come, I understand that too. A." She read it 4 times. The A at the end, not Ashbourne, not even Alexander, just that single initial, informal and almost intimate, did not help her state of mind. She wrote back, "Nothing is wrong. I will be there Tuesday." She was there Tuesday. He said nothing about her absence. He had the accounts open, and a new set of figures relating to the Mill Cottage, and they went to work, and for an hour it was exactly as it had always been. The two of them bent over papers in the quiet library, the fire, the late spring morning light. Then he said without looking up, "You heard about Lady Sophia." Charlotte's pen stopped. "Mrs. Alderton," she said. "Mrs. Alderton," he agreed. A silence. "Your Grace." "Don't," he said quietly. She looked up. He was looking at her directly, with none of the careful composition she was accustomed to, with something open and slightly unguarded in his expression. "My mother wrote," he said. "She frequently writes. She has been writing variations of the same letter for 3 years. I have not yet acted on any of them." "That is—" Charlotte stopped herself. "That is your business." "It is," he said. "I wanted you to know." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that she had learned meant he was choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully, precisely, with no room for misunderstanding. "Because," he said, "I have come to value your opinion more than anyone else's, and I did not want you to have the wrong one." Charlotte looked at him across the table. She was aware suddenly of the distance between them, not very great, the width of a library table, and the fact that it was not as great as the distance she had been trying to maintain. "Alexander," she said, and she used his name for the first time deliberately and watched his expression change. "What is it you're trying to say?" He looked at her steadily. "I am trying," he said, "to say it correctly. I have apparently been practicing the direct approach from a certain source, and I am finding it uncomfortable?" "Necessary," he said, "and rather terrifying." Charlotte pressed her lips together. "We should finish the Mill Cottage figures," she said. "Yes," he agreed. They finished the Mill Cottage figures, but something had shifted in the room, settled into a new configuration, and Charlotte walked home through the spring afternoon, knowing that they were moving, whether they named it or not, towards something that would require both of them to be braver than they had so far managed. The Cavendish family came in the 2nd week of May. Charlotte knew they had arrived because Mrs. Alderton told her, and because she could see the extra carriages at the hall from the upper window of the inn, and because the whole village seemed to hold its breath in the particular way it did when something dramatic was impending. She went about her work. She managed the inn, tended to her father, wrote letters to the parish council about the school repairs, spoke to Mr. Carver about the roof. She did not go to the hall. The invitation came on Wednesday. "Miss Beaumont, my mother has asked me to extend an invitation to the small dinner at the hall on Friday evening. I'm adding my own request. Please come." A. She stared at it. She thought of 7 reasons not to go. She went. The dinner was not small. There were 14 people. The Cavendish family, several local landowners, 2 neighbours from Bath who had travelled with the Dowager, and Charlotte, who had never attended a dinner at Ashbourne Hall and was the only person in the room without a title to her name. Lady Sophia Cavendish was everything Charlotte was not. Tall, classically beautiful, immaculately dressed, effortlessly composed. She moved through the room like someone who had been trained for rooms exactly like this one since the age of 5, which she almost certainly had been. Charlotte was not envious. She was honest enough to admit that. She recognized Lady Sophia's ease for what it was, the product of a particular kind of upbringing, no more impressive in itself than any other skill. But she was also honest enough to admit that watching Alexander speak to Lady Sophia across the dinner table, politely, correctly, with that careful attention he gave to everyone, made the inside of her chest feel like a room where the fire had gone out. She ate her soup. She answered questions from the local landowner on her left about the drainage project, with her usual fluency, redirecting the conversation whenever it threatened to become a commentary on her presence at the table. She did not look toward the head of the table more than 3 times. After dinner in the withdrawing room, the Dowager Duchess found her. She was a small woman, sharp-eyed, clearly intelligent, and had the particular manner of someone who had been managing social situations for 50 years and found no situation beyond her management. "Miss Beaumont," she said, "my son has spoken of you." "I hope favourably," Charlotte said. "Truthfully," the Dowager said with a thin smile, "which in my experience is rarer and considerably more interesting." She studied Charlotte with the frank assessment of a woman who sees no reason to pretend she is not assessing. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect, Your Grace?" "A managing woman, someone who saw an opportunity and pursued it." A pause. "Alexander tells me the road repairs were your doing." "The road repairs were the Duke's doing. I provided information." "Kai says that is not accurate." "I think," Charlotte said, "that the Duke is generous." "He is not, actually," the Dowager said. "He is precise. It is one of his most consistent qualities, and occasionally his most infuriating one." She tilted her head. "He told me you were the first person in Ashbourne who spoke to him as though he were simply a person." Charlotte was silent. "He did not say it as a complaint," the Dowager added. "I did not know who he was." "No, but you know now, and you still do it." The old woman looked at her steadily. "That is not nothing, Miss Beaumont." Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened and Alexander came in, moving through the room with the calm purpose she recognized, scanning it in the way she had first noticed at the inn until he found her. He crossed to them. "Mother," he said with a warmth and a wariness that coexisted naturally, the particular emotional shorthand of long family love. "Are you terrorizing my guest?" "I am conducting an assessment," the Dowager said serenely. "It is going well." She drifted away toward the other side of the room with perfect elegance. Alexander looked at Charlotte. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be. She is formidable. I like her." Something in his expression softened. "She likes you too, which is—" He stopped. "Which is?" "Unprecedented," he said, "in my memory." Charlotte looked across the room to where Lady Sophia stood, beautiful and gracious, speaking to the Dowager now with practiced ease. "Alexander," she said. "Yes." "I need to know—" She stopped, started again more precisely. "I need to understand what I am doing here, not in this room. In general, what this is." The words came out more directly than she had intended, but this, she had learned, was what happened when she used his name. Something in her became more honest. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that you know." "I know what I hope," she said. "I am not certain hope is sufficient evidence." The barest, quickest crack in his composure. His eyes dropped to his hands for a moment, and when they came back to her face, something had shifted, and she understood with sudden, clear certainty that whatever he was feeling, it was not small, and it was not managed, and it had been going on for considerably longer than she had allowed herself to believe. "The library," he said, "tomorrow, not for accounts." She looked at him. "Just to talk," he said. "All right," she said. She left shortly after, walking back through the spring night with her shawl around her shoulders, and the sound of the restored fountain at the back of the hall, following her down the drive, and she thought about something her father had said. "They're not why you get up early on Tuesday mornings," and she thought she finally understood exactly what the correct answer to that was. The library the next morning was very quiet. She arrived at 10. He was already there, standing at the window looking out at the garden, hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she came in, and something in his face that had always been slightly held back, slightly in reserve, was simply present. "Sit," he said, "please." She sat. He remained standing for a moment, looking at her with the expression that had made her catalogue begin, the one she had never quite managed to categorize. She understood it now. It was the look of a man who sees something very clearly, and is trying to decide whether clarity is enough to justify speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I came to Ashbourne the first time, not the reason I gave you, the estate, the accounts, the actual reason." Charlotte waited. "I had been in London for months," he said, "dealing with everything, the legal matters, the steward, the process of understanding what had actually been happening here. It was a great deal to manage." He paused. "A friend suggested I come here myself, not to fix it from a distance, but to see it. I resisted for a long time. Then one morning I was tired of managing everything from afar, of reading about a place in letters, of knowing a village through its accounts and never through itself. So you came. So I came, as a traveller. No title, no expectations, just to look." His voice was steady but not detached. She could hear what it cost him to say things this plainly. "I intended to stay 3 days, make notes, leave. You stayed 7. You were at the counter," he said. "On the first evening, you looked at me the way no one looks at me, as though I had no particular significance and would need to demonstrate any I claimed." Charlotte's mouth curved. She couldn't help it. "I was deciding whether you were worth a room," she said. "I know. And then you argued with me about the table, and He exhaled. "I was absolutely done. I knew before the first evening was over that I was not leaving in 3 days." "You could have told me who you were." "Yes," he said, "I should have. I know that. But I needed those conversations, Charlotte, not for the information, for what they were. Someone speaking to me directly. Someone who expected me to be better and said so plainly, and did not temper it with deference or fear. I have not," he stopped. "I have not had that. Not ever. Not since I was 21, he said quietly. Not since the title. When you have a title, people around you rearrange. They become filtered. Everything comes through glass. You hear what they think you want to hear or what they fear the consequences of not saying. You lose He searched for it. The friction, the real friction of real opinion. "And I provided friction," Charlotte said. "In extraordinary quantities," he said. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out of something that was mostly emotion and only partly amusement, and he looked startled for a moment, as though the sound had caught him completely off guard, and then something opened entirely in his face, and he laughed too quietly, and the library felt warmer. When the laughter faded, the silence it left was different, gentler, less careful. "I am not angry," Charlotte said. "I was. I have considered it carefully, which is what I do with everything, and I have concluded that I understand why you did what you did, and that I would have done something very similar in your position, and that the results," she gestured at the window at the village beyond it, "are not small. They aren't. But," she said, "I want you to know something in return. Tell me." She looked at him steadily. "Those conversations," she said, "I valued them before I knew who you were, not for information, not as transactions. I have had very few conversations in my life with someone who listened to me as though what I thought had weight, as though I was," she paused, choosing carefully, "a peer." The word landed in the room quietly. He crossed to the chair across from her, not slowly, not dramatically, but with decision, and sat down, and the distance between them was now the narrowest it had ever been, just the end of the library table, nothing else. "You are," he said, "my peer in every way I can think of, in every way that matters. That is a significant thing to say." "Yes? Are you saying it precisely?" "Charlotte," his voice was very low, "I have thought about very little else for 3 months. I am saying it as precisely as I know how. I am asking—" He stopped, started again. "I am asking if you would be willing to consider—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I know what you were going to say. You—" "Alexander." She leaned forward slightly, not much, just enough. "I get up early on Tuesday mornings, that is my answer." He was very still. And then, slowly, with the care he gave to everything, he reached across the corner of the table, and his hand came to rest over hers, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, just sat there with his hand over hers, and the morning light coming in through the tall windows, and the restored garden outside, and the whole village below, going about its day. "I should have told you," he said quietly, "on the first evening, or the second, or at least before the 7th. "Perhaps," she said. "But then we might have had fewer arguments." "We will have many more," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." They were married in July. in the small chapel on the hall's grounds that had been restored along with the fountain and the east garden wall. It was not a grand ceremony. The dowager declared it practically peasant, with an expression that made entirely clear she considered this a compliment. Charlotte wore her mother's dress, altered with new ribbon. Her father walked her down the aisle with careful steps and clear eyes, and the expression of a man who had hoped for exactly this and had the wisdom not to have mentioned it. Alexander stood at the altar and watched her come toward him with the expression she had in the privacy of her own heart, always called the real one, the rare one, the one she had wanted to deserve again, months ago in the library, without knowing how much she already had. 3 years later. The North Rose Garden was Charlotte's idea. She had designed it herself in the winter of their first year together, on the back of an estate account she had finished reviewing, and Alexander had found the drawing and had the gardeners begin the following spring without telling her, until the beds were already turned. Their daughter Eleanor was born in the second spring. She had Charlotte's eyes and Alexander's stillness, and an expression of absolute assessment that she had worn since her first day in the world, as though she was taking stock of everything and reserving judgment. Their son James arrived 2 years after, loudly, enthusiastically, with a complete absence of his father's composure and his mother's precision, making up for both with a generosity of spirit that made everyone in the house smile. On the afternoon of Eleanor's 3rd birthday, Charlotte sat in the rose garden with James on the grass beside her and Eleanor in her arms, and Alexander came through the gate from the house and stopped when he saw them. She watched his face. The real smile, immediate, unguarded, the one that changed him entirely. He came and sat beside her on the bench, not saying anything, and Eleanor reached for his coat with one decisive small hand, and he let her take a fistful of dark wool and held it there. "The drainage survey came in," he said after a moment. "And?" "Good, better than expected. I told you it would be." "You did." He turned to look at her. "You usually do." "I know," she said. He took her hand. The way he had taken it in the library that first morning, carefully with decision. She had stopped noticing it as a gesture and started noticing it as a language, the particular grammar of this man who used words precisely and touch precisely and the notebook precisely, who had come to her village in secret and listened to her speak for 7 evenings and gone away and done every single thing she had said needed doing. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know, you always have that look." "What look?" "The look where you are about to tell me something I have not yet thought of, but should have." Charlotte smiled. "The school." "What about it?" "It needs a teacher, a real one. Not Mrs. Plum, who means very well and knows her Bible and almost nothing else." "All right. I have some thoughts." "Of course you do. Are you going to write them down?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced the notebook, a new one, the 4th or 5th since she had first seen it in the inn, and opened it to a clean page. She looked at the blank page. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the calm and the attention, and that thing in his eyes that she had spent months cataloguing, and had long since stopped cataloguing because it had a name now, simple and certain, and names made the cataloguing unnecessary. "Go on then," he said quietly. And Charlotte Beaumont, Charlotte Hartwell, began to talk. The Thornwood Inn still stood at the centre of Ashbourne. Its windows still glowed amber on winter evenings, and the fire was still high, and travellers still came through on their way to places that mattered more. But those who stayed noticed that the roads were smooth now, and the bridge at the north end was new, and the village had a school with a proper roof and a hospital that smelled of clean linen and useful things. They sometimes asked the innkeeper's daughter, an old man's granddaughter now in the way that time moved, who had done all this. She would smile. "There was an argument," she would say, "in this room about a table," and she would let them work out the rest for themselves.
Lanterns shaking in the wind. A stranger stepped inside the inn, like he had nowhere left to go again. She didn't know his name or crown, just the way he watched the room, like every story in that place was something he had come to prove. She spoke her mind like thunder in the dark, about a duke who never cared. And he just listened quietly to every word she dared. At the table by the fire, where the night burned slow. She was just a girl with anger, he was someone she didn't know. But somewhere in the arguing between the truth and pride, a duke who ruled 1,000 lands found the one he couldn't hide. And the village roads were broken, but something else was new, because the man behind the title had finally listened to you.
7 nights of wine and rain, 7 nights of honest war. She fought him with every word like no one had before. Ink on paper, quiet plans, secrets written line by line. He left before the morning came, but carried every word of hers in mind.
She thought the stranger disappeared like travelers always do, but the truth rolled back to Ashburn in a carriage dressed in blue. At the table by the fire, where the truth was told, she was fighting for a village, he was learning to be bold. And somewhere in the silence between the past and pain, a duke who ruled 1,000 lands was falling once again. The roads began to mend, the town began to breathe, because the girl who spoke too loudly was the one he chose to believe. You can wear a crown for years and never once be seen, until a voice without permission says exactly what you mean. And love is not a ballroom dance or titles carved in stone. Sometimes it's just an argument that finally feels like home.
At the table by the fire, where it all began, she was only telling truth, he was only just a man.
But somewhere in the storm, between courage and desire, a kingdom found its future at a table by the fire. And the girl who feared no duke, and the duke who chose her voice, built a life from 7 evenings and one impossible choice.